Good afternoon from Berlin, and a very warm welcome to everybody joining us today for one of the events of our 50th anniversary, and today is on Libya, where we have a situation that despite a ceasefire 2 years ago, there has been very limited progress towards the constitutional framework that is required to enable the much postponed elections. And there's also been a worrying reappearance of violence and all the while very serious human rights situation, particularly for migrants. So joining us today for an event where I think the exam question for today's discussion is, what is the future UN role in Libya, and what can local and international peace builders do to support those efforts? And joining us is our colleague from Berghof, Sonja, who will moderate the event. And we have three very special guests, two of whom have written rather important books on Libya. First is Wolfram Lacher from the SWP, or the German Institute for International Security Affairs here in Berlin. The second is my former close colleague, Ian Martin, who has been the UN Special Representative in a number of particularly hot spots, and including Libya. And as befits former Secretary General of Amnesty International, he has been very key in a topic that is extremely close to my heart, which is efforts to bring human rights and mediation more in sync, and for them not to be seen, as they unfortunately are by a number of people, as almost contradictory activities. And that brings me to our third distinguished participant, Elham, who is the co-founder and the director of Lawyers for Justice in Libya, with a background in human rights. And she's advised several Libyan, European, and international bodies on the Libyan conflict. So with that, I'm very happy to hand the floor to my colleague and friend, Sonja.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And again, a very warm welcome to our three panelists today, to Elham, Ian, and Wolfram. And also a warm welcome to all of you who joined this discussion online today. My name is Sonja Neuweiler, and I'm a senior advisor with the Berghof Foundation. I will lead you through today's event. It has been a very troubled decade for Libya, and it's more than 11 years ago, basically, that civil war broke out following the uprising against Gaddafi's regime, the following international intervention, which basically had a mandate to protect civilians, but ultimately led to the fall of the regime, and a very troubled transition process started. It repeatedly reached deadlock. Several rounds of political dialogue followed, but rival governments emerged, and armed militias kept competing over power, with the backing of course, also various external players. So today, Libya remains deeply divided and fragmented, with various armed and political factions and still partly divided institutions. After several rounds of internal fighting, and with support of the United Nations, the international community, there had been a ceasefire reached in 2020, which also paved the way for unity government and some more hopeful steps forward. So the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum was established to reactivate the transition process and to also prepare the ground for elections. But since then, presidential elections have been scheduled, but were also repeatedly postponed again, and clashes broke out also in between. So in today's session, we would like to jointly discuss with you some of the current challenges that Libya is facing today. And we would also like to analyze some of the key drivers of the current conflict constellation, and look into the role of the international community and what it can do to also support the peace process in the future. So we hope to not only look at the challenges, but also look at some of the opportunities and prospects for the Libyan transition process. But before we start, I would like to briefly mention a few points for the discussion today. I have asked our three panelists to kickstart the discussion with a few reflections, but we would also like to make this an interactive discussion and give you a chance to contribute to this discussion. So there is the Q&A function, where we would encourage everyone to write their questions. The chat function will be disabled, so please use the Q&A function, and also the raise hands function will be disabled. So it's really in the Q&A functions where the questions can be posed, and we will take them up throughout the discussion. I would also like to briefly mention that this event is recorded, So all questions will be asked anonymously and there will not be any attribution of names. Now, I would really like to start our discussion, and I would like to start with you, Ian. Ian Martin is a human rights activist. He has a very extensive UN background. He had several positions for the UN in Haiti, in Rwanda, in Timor-Leste, in Nepal, among others. But what is very interesting for us today is that you were also the special representative of the Secretary General in Libya in 2011 and 12, and you were heading the United Nations mission to support United Nations mission in support mission in Libya, UNSMIL, right? Okay. In any case, Ian, I would like to ask you, based on your first-hand experiences, your time back then in Libya, what happened in 2011 and 12 that is still relevant for today's conflict constellation, or that can help us in understand a few of the challenges that Libya is facing? And maybe may I also ask you maybe to critically reflect what the limits are of explaining today's situation with past events. So with this rather long question, I would like to hand over to you and give you the chance to please share a few reflections with us.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Andrew, for your introduction. Quo vadis is certainly the all-important question, but I didn't write the book that you referred to, Andrew, because I thought I had the answer to what to do now, although I do think that today's discussion of Libya should be better rooted in a better understanding of what happened in 2011-2012. And I wrote the book in part because I was increasingly irritated by today's discourse, which I think is often extremely simplistic, referring to Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya in the same breath when they're very different in terms of interventions, whatever judgment one makes in retrospect of each of them. The Russian narrative, the West should never have intervened to overthrow Gaddafi. President Obama, the intervention was justified, but not thinking of the day after was the worst mistake of his presidency. I think all of those are very simplistic portrayals. But I also wanted to write about 2011-2012 because I had left Libya after its first election in July 2012, relatively optimistic still about its future, and felt a need to ask what could have been done differently in that early period that might have averted some of the conflict and crises that have happened since. It may be, Sonja, that the immediate relevance of some of the 2011-2012 issues is limited. But I want now to refer to two major issues that I do write about in my book that are still, I think, absolutely central today. One is the question of when elections should be held and under what conditions if they're to serve a cause of peace and conflict resolution. And secondly, what to do about a multiplicity of armed groups that don't operate under clear government authority. So briefly on each of those. A number of people, including my successor as special representative in Libya, Tarek Mitri, argue that the 2012 election was held too soon. Some people even say the international community shouldn't have pushed Libya into an early election. Well, it didn't. It was an entirely Libyan decision taken actually in Benghazi in August 2011, before the overthrow of Gaddafi, when a roadmap was debated, and a roadmap that would have merely enlarged the transitional authorities without an election while the constitution was drafted before holding an election was strongly rejected by almost all voices on the insistence that there must be early elections. And that indeed was the public mood when we found ourselves on the ground in Libya, and indeed Libyans went ahead in Misrata, Benghazi, holding elections without either encouragement or support from the international community, and perhaps precisely because Gaddafi had denied Libya elections for so long, there was an absolute determination that democratic elections must take place. And I don't believe there should be a doctrine about when post-conflict elections should take place. I think it's highly context specific. And in the case of Libya, the National Transitional Council and the interim government that it appointed had extremely conditional authority in their own eyes and in the eyes of Libyan people. But what did happen is that there was real cooperation across factions to agree on a framework for those elections and to deliver them. Armed groups themselves largely cooperated in providing security for elections rather than seeking to influence their course. And there was considerable elation when a very good election was held in July 2012. But what it didn't do, or what we had hoped, was that General National Congress elected in 2012 would provide the basis for a government whose legitimacy would be accepted nationwide and would have the authority to tackle the major post-conflict tasks in Libya. And what is an even more relevant question today is what went wrong after that election in 2013, 2014, and how one can anticipate the problems that may follow from an election and ensure that it serves a positive path forward. Now, that's particularly important in relation to the other question I want to refer to, how to address the issue of armed groups, because Libya faced, I think, a genuinely unique post-conflict scenario in their multiplicity. Wolfram is the authority on how the nature of Libyan society led to its fragmented security sector. What I try to look at in my book, which is essentially about the international engagement, is how the nature of the international military intervention contributed to that post-conflict scenario and what responsibilities should have followed from that. And again, today the discourse is often very simplistic. People still talk about a NATO no-fly zone when not only was it much more than no-fly zone, it was an attack on ground forces and something that became from an operation protecting civilians, defending towns and cities under attack from Gaddafi, and became support to the advance of rebel forces. That, I think, is reasonably well understood. But what is less understood is the role of bilateral actors in the ground war. And I say that despite the very good writings of Fred Wary, for example, as well as Wolfram, indicating what did go on the ground, and which I've tried to put together. The secret special forces operation of a number of countries. And former Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, writes about it in his memoir like this: with our allies, France, Qatar, and the UAE, we ended up steering the ramshackle Libyan army from a secret cell in Paris, providing weapons, support, and intelligence to the rebels planning an assault on Tripoli. This quartet of countries, known internally as the Four Amigos, it's a little ironic, focused on training, equipping, and mentoring effective militias in the West. Though this was known to NATO and the US, we were operating outside the traditional structures. So not only did those four countries in particular, through their special forces, train, monitor, mentor, accompany the rebel armed groups, they supplied arms and ammunition in breach of Security Council sanctions, setting a pattern of disrespect for the arms embargo, which has continued to this day. And they contributed to the fragmentation of armed groups because they provided that support outside any chain of command, and indeed contributed to later tensions. And Wolfram has written particularly about the way in which Qatar and the UAE provided support to different groups, particularly in Western Libya in the Nafusa Mountains, and those tensions only escalated later on. So the intervention left Libya with a unique challenge. On the one hand, a multiplicity of armed groups, and on the other hand, no state army to integrate them into. And frankly, the international community isn't very good at conventional security sector reform and DDR, as it's called, even when the challenge is to integrate one rebel army into a state army. There's simply no precedent for an effective way of developing a security sector out of that situation. But what it did do is it left external actors, I think, with a responsibility that they didn't fulfill. And today we have a different range of external actors who, even more by supporting different armed groups, now have a responsibility to use their influence not to encourage proxy conflict, but to enable Libya now to address that divided security sector. So those, I think, elections in the security sector are two central challenges that have carried forward all the way from 2012 to today.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks particularly also for complexifying what you describe as a somewhat simplistic narrative that has emerged over the years. And thanks also for highlighting a few of the challenges that are really still kind of relevant today, and we will also look into deeper later throughout the discussion, particularly the issue of elections, the timing, the conditions, but also the role of armed groups and the importance of finding a framework for integrating them and putting them under unified structure. This is a very nice bridge, actually, to our second input. And I would like to introduce Wolfram again. Wolfram is the Libya and North Africa expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He has been very closely observing the conflict in Libya and analyzing it over the years, with a particular focus also on the role of armed groups in Libya, but also in the Sahel and beyond. And Wolfram, you've also been repeatedly in Libya and done field research, talked to many actors over the years. So it would be very interesting for us if you could give us a little bit of an analysis, or your analysis, of the current conflict constellation, and to also share your reflections on what would need to happen, basically, in order to put Libya back on a peaceful footing for the future, and what key actors can do in that regard. What can key political actors do, armed actors, but also what the international community could do.
Okay, thank you, Sonja, and thanks to Berghof for organizing this event. The current situation, essentially since the elections that were supposed to be held late last year didn't take place, has been one of an impasse. An impasse where we have a stalemate between two competing governments. So after a superficial reunification under this government of national unity last year, Libya reverted to its long-standing state of division between rival administrations, state that we had seen between 2014 and beginning of last year. And the situation has been one of stalemate between these two rival governments of Abdelhamid Dbeibeh on the one hand, Fathi Bashar on the other hand, and each of these two governments has rival or competing coalitions of armed groups associated with them. And it's not only a situation of stalemate on the ground, it's also a situation where there is no process, no political process to negotiate a way out of this situation. And in the absence of such a political process, tensions have been bubbling. We've seen repeated waves of fighting in Tripoli over the last few months. And in the absence of a negotiating process, it's quite possible that we may see further conflict in the future. Now, one important aspect of this impasse is the absence of an internationally led process, political process. There has been no such process essentially since the elections didn't take place. And there really has been an absence of international leadership over the last year, be it the leadership of the UN, which has traditionally over the past 10 years led the international role in Libya, but over the past year that leadership has been absent. Remains to be seen whether, with the appointment of a new special representative, and well, who is now starting to work on the ground, whether that will change. And also, we haven't seen any individual states fill the vacuum of international leadership, leaving aside a few half-baked unilateral initiatives from regional states. Now, adding to all of this, to the stalemate on the ground, to the absence of leadership at the international level, to the absence of a political process, there is also, quite frankly, a dearth of good new ideas for how to get out of this situation. We know the reasons that brought us, or that brought Libya to this situation. We know the reasons why the elections failed last year, but I don't think there are good ideas for how to make it better, how to avoid these mistakes in another attempt. So the current professed goal by international actors, by the UN, by Western governments, remains elections as a way of getting out of this situation. But there is no clear plan, roadmap, no ideas for how to make it, how to get there differently than last time when it failed. We know what the obstacles were last time around. We know that, first of all, there are a range of key Libyan actors who don't want elections, starting with majorities in the two legislative bodies, and continuing with the two competing governments of Dbeibeh and Bashara, none of whom want elections because it would mean that they have to leave their positions. And ironically, or the problem really is that for the last few years, international actors have been trying to rely on precisely these entities and these Libyan actors to pave the way for elections. And clearly, this hasn't worked for very obvious reasons. But it's hard to see how an alternative path to elections could look like that would bypass these formal bodies or would not exclusively rely on these formal bodies. And it's quite clear that at the international level, there's not much support for even looking for alternative paths that wouldn't rely essentially on these formal actors. Second, we know that a big obstacle big obstacle to elections was that for the actors to Libya's conflicts, elections are a high-risk endeavor, and that particularly goes for presidential elections, which really open up a winner-takes-all scenario that is very difficult to contemplate for many Libyan actors, which is why last year they resorted to trying to manipulate the electoral framework in a way that would skew the playing field in their favor, which in turn isn't acceptable for their adversaries. And this was fundamentally why the process failed last year. Now, did internationals try to counteract these attempts at manipulation, at manipulating the playing field sufficiently robustly? I don't think so. In fact, we saw that in some cases they enabled these attempts, particularly when it came to the head of the East-based parliament's effort to impose his very own private presidential elections law, which was then accepted by the UN. And this was a fatal step in the failure of the electoral process. So if there is another push, do we think that the UN, do we think that Western governments will adopt a more robust approach to attempts at manipulating the playing field? Currently, there is not really any reason to believe so. And then a third obstacle in this whole attempt to hold elections in Libya has been that there are a number of foreign states who act as veto players in this process. For example, last year we saw that Egypt and France absolutely insist that there must be presidential elections, don't want to contemplate parliamentary elections only. Of course, there are also, significant chunks of the Libyan political landscape who have the same position. But we saw last year that these two states supported the attempts of the head of the East-based parliament at unilaterally imposing a presidential elections law, which again was a fatal mistake. So again, if we see another attempt at holding elections, will there be a more robust international approach towards such foreign meddling? It currently doesn't look like it. And so for these and other questions related to the absence of a credible judiciary, the absence of neutral security forces, there are fundamental questions about whether it is realistic to hold elections in Libya in the short term as a way out of the crisis. So I fully agree with Ian's point that there shouldn't be a doctrine of post-conflict elections, and I agree with his assessment of the 2012 elections, that they were necessary and overall had a positive impact back then. But in the current situation is obviously much more problematic. All of that said, there are also no credible alternative paths out of this situation. There are no credible alternatives to elections, which again goes back to this dearth of good new ideas that is really a key part of the current crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wolfram, also for this very, very complex analysis, although also quite pessimistic, I must say. But also thanks for highlighting really these crucial key challenges of also the absence of a process forward, the absence of real ideas of how to basically organize a process that could really also negotiate these key issues. And thanks also for linking back to Ian's account of the timing and critical role of elections. I would now like to also ask Elham to come in and to also provide a Libyan perspective to the whole analysis that we're doing here. Elham Saudi is the co-founder and director of Lawyers for Justice in Libya. Elham, you have a substantive human rights background. You're an expert in international humanitarian law, and you've also been involved yourself in the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. And I would like to ask you to look at Libya today again, to describe for us what key challenges you see, and also to draw a few reflections or share a few reflections from your own involvement in the LPDF, and also the lessons you might take from that. Thanks, Elham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonja. And to follow Ian's lead with trying to complicate the narrative, I would never profess to be representing the Libyan perspective. I think that is a very high and very unattainable goal, because there is obviously a variety of views there. I can only speak to what we see as activists and lawyers as the issues that are worth considering. And also, I guess it's good for me to come as the third speaker, because I sort of a primary requirement of my job as an activist is to be optimistic. So hopefully I can counter some of the pessimism that we've heard. Look, for me, I think there is a fundamental challenge, and it hasn't really come out fully in the conversation so far. And for me, a lot of the problems that have been highlighted, a lot of the issues that have been highlighted, the very correct narrative of the situation currently in terms of the key actors that has been highlighted by Wolfram, and the kind of trajectory of getting to there by Ian. I think that all stems to a very simple, and maybe I'm simplifying the narrative, but sometimes it's good to get some clarity on causes. And for me, I think it comes down to a culture of impunity that has been perhaps the one constant in the Libyan story to date. And out of that, kind of culture of impunity, the lack of accountability at every level, sort of capital letter accountability from the criminal perspective, but also lower case accountability of the ability to hold your own representatives accountable. That's where we get to the situation now where we see ongoing violations, where the corruption is rife at every level, people's absolute loss of belief in the rule of law. All that stems from an inability to really correct course through accountability. And this permeates through all levels in the Libya situation, from the citizens to the institutions, to the politicians, to the UN mission overseeing the process. And the focus on a political solution founded on appeasement to date has failed us over and over again. So we take the LPDF process as an example, and to try to be a slightly more, if you like, detailed in the example. If you look at the vetting criteria that was applied in that process to select the government of national unity, there is nothing in there really that talks to accountability of the candidates. And so as a result, in the final round of that process, we had one person implicated in severe and significant human rights violations against a person who's implicated in severe and serious corruption allegations. And then we see that precedent recreated in the elections at the end of last year, where the vetting criteria similarly did not prioritize vetting people from the perspective of their human rights record or their legal record, and ensuring that those who are seriously implicated in violations do not get to stand. It's ironic at the time of that election, you'll recall perhaps that there was a lot of outrage at Saif being able to run in those elections, but frankly, he was one of the few legal candidates because the drafting of the election law that was being used did not cover people who are wanted by the International Criminal Court. And so I think when you found your political process in a basis of appeasement of perpetrators and impunity for criminals or people implicated in crimes, then you set the scene for what we see today. So I want to think of three things to think about as we look ahead, because perhaps the one thing I'll say as a Libyan, as opposed to as an activist or a human rights lawyer, is that it is exhausting that we spend so much time listening to experts discussing all that is wrong and the sort of fait accompli of the Libyan situation, as opposed to taking a moment to think, okay, well, what can be changed in the course so we don't repeat ourselves? Because when we've seen the political processes in the past, they tend to be a copy-paste model of some sort. And so I think I want to just focus on three things to think about, and perhaps we can discuss some of these in the conversation. One is really genuinely, fully rethink the composition of the table. For there to be any credibility to a future process, Libyan citizens must be re-enfranchised into the process. I keep coming back to the theme of vetting, but the process must be vetted with the public before it's even sort of logistically built. There needs to be proper consultations, not a couple of Zoom calls with people from the public, a long process where there is a consultation with people across the country about what they seek out of this process, what they are looking forward to, what an election genuinely means to them. And key within that demographic are people who have been impacted by this, including victims of the violations we keep referencing. It will take longer and will require a very open mind to be able to structure and restructure the process, but it might be able to be one not only that gets us a more credible result, but actually one in which we as Libyans have ownership in the process and will defend it. And that's what makes these processes legitimate in the eyes of the public. And so I think there needs to be a genuine process where there is a deliberate inclusion of those who are impacted by the conflict, as opposed to just those who perpetrate the conflict. The second point is looking at the legal framework, and I know that Wolfram alluded to that in his intervention. But again, here I think we need to think about the law not as a means to an end, but as seeing the rule of law as the core of the next phase. And so when we think about election laws or constitutional processes, they can't be decided and designed in a way that is only intended to reach an end of an election or to reach an end of a, to get us to a specific end, because then you're co-opting the legal process as opposed to fundamentalizing it. And so the constitutional process needs to be not created to reverse engineer a process. So the danger of that is you end up creating another proof precedent for Libya, like I mentioned in the past. And so I think, trying to construct a constitutional process with the current actors is not going to work. And that goes to the point that was just raised about what kind of elections are we talking about when we talk about elections. And, I have been very clear that I think, what we need is a solid legal status and a legal basis, for this. And for that, the only thing that will really achieve that is a new legislative body that can take that process forward. You cannot have the current body that is only interested in maintaining the status quo drafting the process for transition. And so, in my mind, there's a sequence of having a new legislature that creates the relevant constitutional precedent, again, with significant consultation, genuine investment in the process, as opposed to just the outcome of the process, that then sets the framework for a presidential election. I think so far we've been looking at things sequentially, I think in the wrong order. The third point is a point, and it goes back again as a theme to this enfranchisement of the citizen, is transparency. There needs to be a transparent process. We need to see these meetings, these discussions broadcast live. I would say one of the very, very few and very hard-won successes of the LPDF process was the public questioning of candidates. And I think that kind of live session, that kind of debate, that kind of space where people are held, at the very least, is beginning to held accountable for their views and their precedents, is very vital to create credibility in this process. And if we take the previous two recommendations as a whole, it is about taking time and focusing on a process and an approach that allows us to understand what Libya needs and what Libyans need, as opposed to relying on precedents that are from other countries, as the groupings were discussed earlier. And the second part of the transparency is actually creating a safe space for debate of what's happening. And if there's one thing anyone takes away from my intervention today, is that there's a deliberate, institutionalized, systematic crackdown in Libya on civil society. If there's one thing that unifies all these politicians, is that they want to shut down civil society, whether that's the Civil Society Commission in Tripoli, whether that's the internal security agencies, but there is a deliberate sense of shutting down NGOs that talk about this, and journalists and the like who are trying to have a debate about the situation in Libya. And if you talk about the role of the international community in there must be a direct conditionality between having a civic space that is free to be critical, that is free to question, that is free to hold politicians into account as part of the bargain that is being set in place with these politicians. So perhaps I'll end on something that brings all these together. And that I think for us to really change course in Libya, we need to change the approach. There needs to be a purposive approach. Much of the conversation around Libya is about the how. How do we do this? When do we do this? Who's going to take over? Where does that election happen? Where does that? And I think we need to step back and think about the why. Instead of working towards elections as an end into their own eyes, think of them as tools, which is what they should be. And a government is a tool to achieve certain real goals. And I think that at the moment, the international community and Libyan politicians, or the political elite, consider the goal as the election. And that is never going to be a way in which the elections will be effective or safe or peaceful, because then everything relies on winning that, right? But if the process is about ensuring enfranchising citizens, creating a culture of accountability, in the sense of talking about inclusion, then all of a sudden there's not so much weight on the success of the elections, because the process is in itself achieving the purpose of a democracy. And so perhaps I will sound idealistic, or I'll sound optimistic, or I'll sound naive by a comparison to the doom and gloom of some of the political conversation. But as I started, I'll end, and it is my job requirement to be optimistic and to find ways out, because like with everything in Libya, it is always civil society that has to fill the gap. And so, and I guess that ends with the point of why civil society needs to be protected. I'll leave it there because I want to have room for a conversation.
Thanks so much, Elham, for this also very deep analysis and also for highlighting a number of additional points. I think what I take from your input as well is a little bit the way forward that needs to be discussed in terms of what are the key issues to be negotiated and in which sequence and by whom, basically, which with a very strong focus on inclusivity. And you mentioned civil society. I think we should go deeper into that. But you also opened the path for a discussion of how could a process actually look like. I would like to also play these questions back to our other two panelists and give them a chance to respond and react to this. But before that, I would like to briefly also remind everyone that there is the Q&A function. So I see questions already coming in, but I want to encourage you all to write your questions in the chat. So not in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A function, and we will take them up also throughout the discussion. So I would now like to ask or challenge you, Wolfram, also a little bit to think forward and to basically give us a sense, on the one hand, the key issues that need to be negotiated, the priorities, basically, maybe some ideas of how a process could look like, also based on Elham's input, the role of different actors therein. I would hope you could share some reflections with us, and then I will also refer back to Ian.
Yeah, so the issue of who should be at the table has been a key issue in Libyan negotiating processes for the last years, essentially since the political split in 2014. And it was always a difficult issue because the political landscape and the military landscape were so fragmented. So actually establishing who needed to be at the negotiating table was quite difficult, even in terms of who was really relevant and who could really represent constituencies, who could really represent forces on the ground. So this has been a key issue. Now, I am sympathetic to Elham's point that those who committed crimes should be held accountable rather than be at the table. But I think that the actual evolution is actually running in the opposite direction. It's obviously not a nice thing to see, but this is where things are headed. I mean, if those who need to be held accountable are exactly the same players who can cause any political arrangement, any agreement to fail, or can prevent it from taking hold in the first place. Is there anyone internationally or in Libya who can prevent them from doing so, who can disempower them? Is there a civil society that can mobilize against these actors, against militia leaders, against the political class? Is there popular mobilization against them? No, we haven't seen this. And for the last year or so, actually, there had been this hope among international diplomats that somehow magically there would be popular mobilization in favor of elections, and that would exert pressure on the political class to loosen its stranglehold over the process. But this hasn't happened. And instead, what has happened over the last years, I would say, is that out of this very, very fragmented military landscape, in which it was always very difficult to establish who actually was relevant, we've seen a process of consolidation. We've seen a number of militia leaders growing ever more important and actually pursuing their political interests increasingly openly and explicitly, negotiating, for example, militia leaders from Tripoli going abroad to negotiate with Haftar's sons about the question of who should govern in Tripoli, which of the two governments should govern in Tripoli, and actually even negotiating about the constitutional basis. Now, we may not like this evolution, but this is broadly where things are headed, and realistically, I don't see any counterweights, neither in Libya nor at the international level, to this evolution. So if there is an arrangement of sorts. At some point, I think that these actors will be a key part of it rather than being held accountable by actors that are not there.
Thanks very much, Wolfram, for a very realistic account of also what you see emerging, the importance of accountability, and at the same time, of course, also the direction that the key actors would rather be the ones negotiating, and that the dilemmas this actually poses. I would like to also ask you, Ian, to comment on these three dimensions. On the one hand, ideas for a process, key issues that need to be negotiated, but also the key actors, and if you like, also maybe some ideas or reflections on what also the international community could do, or from your vast UN background experience, what you think about in terms of possible ideas, or what you would wish to see, hope to see, maybe rather.
Well, first to say that Elham has pointed us to an absolutely central question, which is how the Libyan people come back into the picture, and what is the way in which they can assert their point of view against those who define themselves as political actors. You know, one of the most inspiring things about being in Libya in 2011, 2012 was the vibrancy of a new civil society. And it's deeply depressing to hear from Elham, and I know she's right, that civil society now faces repression in all parts of the country. And Wolfram, I'm afraid, is also right in saying that the hope that there would be some kind of popular mobilization that would introduce a new dynamic into the situation so far hasn't come about. When it comes to the international community, I despair, really. I cannot understand how the international community committed itself and remains committed to a roadmap that includes a presidential election, because a presidential election just clearly seems certain to produce a new form of conflict, since there's no possibility, even if one managed to hold one, that any successful candidate could command unifying support across the country. So I'm entirely with Elham in saying that the place to start is a parliamentary election, which at least produces representation from all parts of the country, and people who can potentially, with some new legitimacy, engage in dialogue with each other and begin to negotiate a constitutional framework. But I mean, I give great credit to Germany for being a neutral political actor that has tried to bring some greater sense of unity and responsibility to the international community, but there can never have been a more foolish international meeting than the one that took place in Paris, was it November last year, at a moment when it was perfectly clear that a December election was not going to happen, that it was perfectly clear that if it did, it would be a disaster, and yet the only thing an international meeting with representation at the highest political level could say was an election must go ahead, and then disagree about whether they meant a presidential election first or simultaneous presidential and parliamentary elections. So a first task, at least with the international community, it seems to me, has to get them away from that. And I really feel for the person who now has the job I once had, Mr. Batterley, the new Special Representative Secretary General, because the roadmap he has inherited, and which presumably key international actors expect him to seek to pursue, is not one that can possibly, in my view, and I think in Wolfram's analysis and Elham's, produce a positive path forward.
Thanks very much. I will give again both panelists also a chance to respond to your comments, Ian, because I think you directly provoke a further discussion with that. I would like to ask you, Elham, before that, to also reflect a little bit on, you mentioned the role of civil society very prominently, but what is it that you see that civil society can contribute under current circumstances, or what kind of support would be needed, or what would you hope for the international community to do?
It happens every time. I think there's two ways to approach this. There is what is the role of civil society, and then what is the role of others towards civil society. And I think in Libya, what we see, whether it's on the provision of services, whether it's on a humanitarian level, whether it's on a legal level, civil society has filled the gap for the state consistently since 2011. It is NGOs that are cleaning the streets in Tripoli from rubbish. It is NGOs that are feeding migrants and looking after their needs in the various camps and on their journeys. It is civil society who's trying to bring legal claims or cases against the perpetrators of violations. All these things that are intended to be as state functions have constantly been picked up by civil society. And I think the framing of the question needs to be slightly different. It's not what should civil society do? It is how can we empower civil society to do what it wants to do? Because I think there is this developing narrative in Libya that civil society can take care of that. And we've had politicians say that to us several times when they're like, well, what's civil society for then? You go educate people, you go explain the elections to people, etc. And so what I don't want is the conversation on civil society to further abdicate the political elite from their duties. So that's just one framing type of question that I'd like to put out there. The second point is the one thing that has consistently happened, whether that's through decrees, like the decrees that were passed by the previous internationally recognized government in Tripoli, whether it's the reactivation of the internal security agencies using the previous Gaddafi regime era powers to silence people and to arrest them, whether it's by armed groups taking matters into their own hands. There have seldomly do we see anything that happens in reaction to that. So the point that I made is key for civil society to be able to do what it wants to do and needs to do. There needs to be a genuine commitment by those with influence on Libya, and here I'm addressing the international actors, that there is a correlation between these things, and therefore there needs to be a conditionality between these things. You do not talk about an election without creating a space for debate before an election. And therefore, for you to be talking about an election, whoever it is that's now going to take this, Germany or others, there needs to be conditionality about certain laws that need to be changed to allow people to actually debate the process. There's many civil society organizations have put statement after statement of what laws need to be repealed. There needs to be genuine questioning when someone disappears, as opposed to, well, we are concerned type statements that come out and then no follow-up after that. Many civil society are in danger because embassies invite them to brief them and then don't protect them after that. And incidentally, under the new framework that's been put in place in Libya, a meeting with an embassy is now an entirely criminal offense. And so that meeting can land you legitimately, using that term loosely as something that applies the law, in jail. And ambassadors will frequently then post on Twitter, I had a great conversation with so-and-so. And so that correlation needs to be addressed. The last part of this as well is, you get civil society doing all the work filling these gaps, and then you're working really hard to pursue someone internationally through universal jurisdiction or the like, and third-party states, the international community, those who are trying to secure peace in Libya, provide immunity for those actors when they're in their country. And so it's not only that you're appeasing this, or there's complicity, if you like, in ensuring accountability does not occur. And so I don't even think it's negligence. I think there is complicity in international actors in the culture of impunity I discuss, because there is no way in which for us to pursue when these same actors are invited to the table are given immunity as a result from us pursuing them. And so I think we need to take a step back. And then the final element, I think, of the international community is the funding that's provided to civil society, with so little being provided for work on accountability, because you'll get either politically unsafe, it's not effective at this moment. It might be a hindrance to the international process of peace. These are all excuses we've been given by donors for not funding accountability work in Libya. And so if you kind of tips on how we can address making civil society more empowered, think about the donor framework that these states involved in Libya set up for civil society. Think about the conditionality of supporting the political elite, and prevent using your own system to block the work of civil society when we're pursuing accountability in your countries.
Thanks very much, Elham. I would like to bring in a few questions also from the audience into our discussion, but also refer, and so one of these questions really pushes us again to look into ideas forward and entry points for for re-establishing a process and also formats how to re-establish a process. And there's also a reference to the Berlin process and the question of what could be done to use such formats also in the future as a way forward, or what additional ideas you have to make them stronger. I think it's a question that I would like to ask you first, Wolfram, and then also give the others a chance to come in if they want to come up with this question, answer to this question.
Okay, well, so the Berlin process was, I mean, initially had the aim of getting foreign meddlers in Libya to curb their support to the warring parties in the 2019-2020 civil war. And in that respect, I think the process, didn't reach its objectives. What happened was that the war stopped, but the two key foreign meddlers, Turkey and Russia, simply cemented their presence and have cemented their presence and are still there today. The Berlin process also provided some kind of political architecture, an architecture for a political process that then led to the formation of this government of national unity. But since then, the end point of the entire process being these elections, with them not taking place, having failed, the Berlin process hasn't really existed anymore. It hasn't been there anymore, and really there hasn't been any process at all, I would say. Yes, there had been UN mediation between the two legislative bodies earlier this year on a constitutional basis, but I don't think anyone seriously expected these negotiations to lead anywhere. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, I think one of the key problems in the last year or so has been the absence of international leadership. And here it would make sense for a state such as Germany to try to play a leading role again, of course, in supporting also the UN, which has been in a very, very difficult position between all these different foreign veto players and foreign meddlers in Libya, so which has been in a much more difficult position in the last few years than it was when Ian Martin was SRSG. And it would make sense, I think, in the current situation for another push. I mean, merely to have a state that actually tries to take the lead on Libya again would already be progress, because a key problem has really been that for almost all foreign states that are somehow involved in Libya, the country has simply fallen far down on the list of priorities. So one simply lets the evolution slide to the point of least resistance. And to counter that, the first step would be, someone trying to take the lead.
Thanks very much, Wolfram. And also I would like to give you, Ian, a chance to comment or add to this. And also in the sense you have been looking also a lot on the role of external actors in the Berlin process, having been one where there was commitment to also abide by what was agreed from the international or from the external actors. So I think that's also somewhat a major contribution. With all, of course, additional challenges that remain, and also the suggestions that Wolfram made for this process to basically continue and help re-establishing international leadership. So please, I would like you to also share your reflections on that.
I think Wolfram is absolutely right. I mean, ideally, it takes a combination of a new approach from a new special representative and some state and then group of states to invest in a serious rethinking of the path forward. It is, I mean, I'm not very optimistic about that, but that actually happening. But it is a possible moment for it, in that the UN Security Council has spent the last sort of 6 months or more simply squabbling and making it impossible for the Secretary General to name a new special representative. At least in theory, it's now united in saying it will support a new special representative and extending the role of UNSMIL. So it is a time when there should be a fresh approach, and it is a very heavy responsibility for that special representative to try both to bring the key international actors into some degree of responsibility and unity on a path forward, and to engage in the kind of consultation in Libya that Elham rightly sees as necessary. And there have been various approaches at national dialogues. The ones led from UNSMIL haven't been spectacularly successful, and the climate is, as Elham has underlined, in some ways even more difficult now than it was. But I don't see an alternative to that combination of approaches.
Thanks very much. Elham, I also want to give you a chance to comment, if you like, also on this idea of a new approach and some of the elements that also Ian put forward now and before Wolfram. And maybe you can also take up one question that came from the audience in this context, also how the constitutional discussion plays into this future approach, because you mentioned it's not only a tool, it should be an objective. So maybe you can link these two questions if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't disagree with what's been said, so I won't. I'll try to widen the conversation, because one of the, when we've all alluded to this, but one of the issues with the international community's lacking, let's say, in the Libyan situation, is that there's also no accountability towards them, and there's no self-reflection on their role. And so you have, and I'm happy to be the one that says this, but you have people within UNSMIL who are implicated with a lot of the issues that we've all raised in terms of the scandals within the political process in Libya. And it seems to me that the model operandi within the UNSMIL, at least, and I can't comment to the wider UN system's role in Libya, but it seems that you get promoted when you're incompetent in UNSMIL, as opposed to getting vetted or removed or replaced. And so, one of the reasons why there's so little trust in the process, or there's so little buy-in, or so little credibility, or so little interest, frankly, is that it's an institution, UNSMIL, within itself, that has lost so much credibility in the last 5 years, and it requires a genuine reckoning. One of the things that happened to me actually and I'm being very personal here, but when the new special rapporteur or special representative was announced, I knew nothing about the person. I hadn't done any of my research on him yet, but I had a sinking feeling of going, okay, so now it's back to the same UNSMIL model. They haven't taken this as an opportunity to shake it up or to apply some of the recommendations that have been met or something. And there was a very bizarre hope in me that perhaps the longer it took to address UNSMIL, the more options we have to be creative in the international community's role, because now it will be this fake standing behind multilateralism and this UN process, but without really vetting that process itself. And so for me, for the process to work, there also needs to be a questioning and a humbling of UNSMIL's role. And so maybe that's something that we can also discuss. In terms of the constitutional process, as someone who has been working on it since 2011 at the very grassroots level at LFJL, out in the streets talking to people about their wishes. There's nothing more depressing than the fact that it has become operationalized and politicized in this way. It was one of the few processes that we kind of wanted to protect, so that it does what it should do, which is create a contract between the citizen and their country. And so for me, this whole necessity to amend the constitution to achieve elections is a false narrative. You can have a constitutional basis for those elections that exists in a separate document and does not touch the constitution at all. And so I think there's a need to think about how we protect this process, which as a constitutional process, it should be so much more than just a means to an end for an election. It's where we're going to put people's rights. It's where we're going to put the duties of the state. It's where we're going to establish the nature of the state and who owes what to whom and how does it work. That cannot all be sacrificed for the sake of what will be a failed election in that context. And then we lose what has been worked on for, you know, the best part of now 11 years of trying to achieve a debate around what the constitution should do for us as citizens and for the country, as opposed to for the politics and the elections. And so that's what I'm thinking about. The more we can separate the constitutional conversation away from the political election one, the better.
Thanks very much, Elham. We have a number of questions also relating to inclusivity, basically. You mentioned the national and political dialogue processes, Ian, before, and I think also, Elham, you had a quite critical reflection, but maybe we can also turn this around and try to hear from you again. What are lessons from the past that could be done differently in the future? And again, here to take up the questions from the audience, one relates to the role of civil society in such national and political dialogues, and also the role of women, and the questions about a more gender-sensitive approach, but also particularly the role of women in such dialogues. And a third dimension refers to also the armed groups and the current power contenders. What can be done to foster their political will to participate in such formats? Sorry, it's a number of questions and it brings together different dimensions. I don't expect you all to answer on all of them, but I would be grateful if you share some ideas on some of the elements you would want to take up. So I would give again the chance to Wolfram first and then go through the panel again.
Okay, so I think that some of the questions that, well, the questions that you just mentioned, again, come back to this issue of, representation at the table, and really this has been a very difficult issue to deal with. If we look at, for example, the LPDF, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, that was established by UNSMIL with major input from humanitarian dialogue in 2020. Of course, the choice of members of that forum, 75 members, triggered quite a lot of controversy in Libya. First of all, the fact that there were so many members of the two legislative bodies, should they actually have such an important role? And second, what about all the others that were chosen on a more or less arbitrary basis? And choosing the stakeholders who need to be at the table necessarily will always be arbitrary, because there are no straightforward principles for how to put together a negotiating table in Libya. For example, you don't have strong parties, political parties that absolutely need to be there. You have a number of key military forces and political military forces who probably need to be represented, but then there are so many others that it is very difficult to represent. When it comes to civil society or to local constituencies, it is almost always contested who can speak for a particular local constituency. So it's a very tricky issue. And when it comes to the particular question on armed groups, how to foster their political will to participate, I don't think that is the issue. So armed groups hadn't been key participants in political negotiating processes from 2014 onwards. First of all, for reasons of optics, the UN and others didn't want to give leaders of armed groups that kind of legitimacy, with the exception of Khalifa Haftar, who was invited to the negotiating table and was given a special status. And for the other reason of fragmentation, that it was quite difficult to establish who needed to be there, and that many armed groups really didn't have that kind of political leadership, that would represent their political interests. And I think that this has been changing. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a process of consolidation, and we're seeing these groups pursuing their political interests more explicitly. So the question is not really what can be done to foster their political will to participate. It's more, I think, a matter of that these actors more and more impose their presence at the negotiating table and need to be reckoned with, and there won't be a way around them.
Thanks very much, Wolfram. Ian.
I think what Wolfram quite rightly says about the impossibility of creating a table, a negotiating table, the limited number of people whose inclusivity is accepted or even should be accepted, does point back to the case for at least the parliamentary election, because there you do at least get representatives of local communities with at least some degree of accountability. You bring them together in a parliament, a congress, and hopefully you then begin a process of constitutional discussion in which you bring in civil society engagement. In 2012, there would not have been any significant representation of women if it were not for the special measures that were introduced into the 2012 General Congress election, and that again can and should be a part of a parliamentary election. So I think maybe I shouldn't call this your roadmap, Elham, but a parliamentary election which, if there were agreement on it, would not be difficult to help. It's not a technical problem. The HNEC is perfectly capable of organising a very respectable parliamentary election. You may need to go back and vet candidates. I'm not sure exactly what happened around the candidates for the potential 2021 election. You have a registration exercise, which was very successful, already carried out. And I think it's absolutely right that should precede the broader constitutional discussion. And of course, if you proceed with a parliamentary election without at that stage a presidential election, you also leave for future discussion the definition of the potential role of a presidency that is always going to be extremely difficult in a country as divided as Libya. So that's a path that I would like to see international and domestic actors increasingly rally around, because for me it's the only real constructive path forward.
Thanks very much, Ian. Elham, please, if you can address the same question, and also add, I think you mentioned it a little bit already, but also what can be done that civil society participation can also be implemented, in the sense that what could be done to support the political will of power holders to let civil society participate.
First of all, Ian, I'm entirely comfortable with you calling it my roadmap, so that's fine. I think can we just probe a little bit the framing of that question, because I think that therein is where the problem is when we're trying to talk to politicians to let civil society participate. I think that framing points to the problem we have, because frankly, we should be working towards a situation where it's not up to any power to let us do our work. They're required by international law and to facilitate for us and to ensure we're protected in our work, not to decide on whether we do it or not. And I think that's a fundamental distinction in some of the language we use around civil society, that or kind of feeds into the narrative that it is a luxury that we should be having, that is granted to us or bestowed on us by the powers that be, as opposed to a fundamental right to have that space within our country. And so I think that I know that I can be pedantic sometimes, but there's a lot of power in language, and it's important to think about these things with words that frame the conversation adequately. I think there's very clear steps that can be done and should be demanded of the Libyan state. One is addressing the legislative problems, the legal problems for civil society, the laws that already, me doing this meeting, that's it. That could legally land me in prison. I'm talking to foreigners about the Libyan situation, suggesting what they should do in it. I mean, that at least 15 years under the current legislation. And so this is what we're talking about. When we're talking about reforming the legal structure in Libya to facilitate civil society, we're genuinely talking about the cost of a meeting like this to a person who attends it. The cost of someone receiving funding from a donor who's also funding the Libyan state's work. A lot of our donors are also the Libyan state's donors, if you want to like, in terms of the partnership agreements they enter into, the memorandum of understanding they enter into, and with third states, also the same states that fund civil society. And so there's this kind of lack of pressure to amend the laws is one thing. The second is, and I repeat again, is thinking about how civil society is supported from a funding perspective, but also from a moral perspective. Last year, a civil society actor who was working for a European state's charitable institution ended up in prison. And when I spoke to that state's official and the ambassador, they're like, yeah, we sent a letter, but we're worried that if we push too hard, it'll make the situation harder for him. He literally got detained for work he was doing for you, and you still feel like you can abdicate your responsibility. This is what we're talking about. It's not some exciting idea or concept or a nice to have. People's lives are literally in danger every single day because of the complacency at best, the complicity at worst of international actors in Libya. The other point that was mentioned in the questions that we didn't get a chance to speak about is the gender element. And I think it's important to take a moment to think about that, because on the LPDF, the one thing that united all of the women is the relentless abuse and harassment we received online, in person, and threats to ourselves in a way that none of the men faced in that room. And so for us to genuinely expect women to participate, the measures need to be put in place to ensure their safety, personal, mental, emotional safety to take part in these positions. Every single part of our life was under scrutiny, from the way we look, to the way we speak, to who we're married to why we've left our children behind to come to that meeting. Relentlessly, I was on average getting 200 to 300 abusive messages on my phone daily throughout the LPDF process. Threats, abuse, harassment. And there's no system to deal with that as well. And then you expect women to participate. Why? When we're not protected or made safe to do so. And I'd like, and just to kind of, again, bring this home, one of the main people harassing me online was physically at that table with me, and nothing was done about him. And so it's really important to really just think about these points when we're talking about civil society participation, when we're talking about gender representation, the real price this costs the people who choose to get involved in that. And I'll just refer to one of our reports. Well, there's a few, but there's one that we looked at specifically on the online violence against women that has become a fundamental phenomenon, and a uniquely gendered one in the Libyan context.
Thanks, Elham, also for very clearly spelling out the very deep challenges and also the need for urgent protection in this context. I would like to take up 2-3 more dimensions from the questions. One is relating to, we have spoken a lot about representation, but one question specifically also asks about representation of different constituencies geographically and the idea of federalism in Libya. Another dimension relates to the key challenges and needs in the state building agenda. And third, the options for also bringing together divided institutions or steps in that regard. So I would like to open the floor to also take up these issues in case one of you would like to, or you all would like to. Is that a sign of volunteering, Wolfram?
Not really, but I mean, on this question of federalism and representation of regions. I think that probably the patterns that we've seen, the political patterns that we've seen develop over the last few years of people mobilizing on the basis of, or like political actors pretending that they represent particular regions and cities, getting positions in the government or getting a seat at the table on this basis, and then using these positions for their own private ends, or for the benefit of their very narrow networks. This is actually an unintended consequence of this formula, parity between regions and cities in negotiating processes, and also more and more within the government portfolios. So in the government formation processes of the two successive unity governments in 2015-16 and then last year, the portfolios were increasingly attributed on the basis, or at least ostensibly on the basis, of parity between, in terms of regional representation of particular cities and tribes. And we saw that what that led to was not that particular constituencies were really represented in the government and benefited from the government, but that government resources ended up benefiting very, very narrow cliques. So this is one problem, I think, with this idea that there is marginalization of particular regions, and that therefore this needs to be rectified through representation on the basis of parity. One problem with this approach is that it has very negative unintended effects that actually end up reinforcing the drivers of the conflict in terms of corruption and pillage of state resources. All that said, I do think that there have long been strong demands for decentralization in particular, and whether you frame this in terms of decentralization to provinces or to regional, whether it's 3 regions or whether it's a base in, like a level further down. So this has been an obvious demand. There hasn't really been any significant progress towards that goal. So this is really a big construction site, I think, that remains for any future political process in Libya.
Thanks very much, Wolfram. Ian, I will invite you to comment as well on these 3 dimensions, or those of those dimensions you would like to pick up. On the one hand, the decentralization, federalism idea, but also the point of the state building agenda, and the third one also the steps towards unifying institutions. So if there's comments you would like to share.
Well, it's hard to begin to talk about the state building agenda or unifying institutions until one has a political framework within which you can build institutions and there's political agreement on unification. So that just seems to me to be subordinated to the general challenge of how one gets to a nationwide accepted framework of governance. And until you have that, what can be done is very limited. The federalism issue was a huge negotiating issue ahead of the 2012 election, and it was the one issue that could potentially have derailed it. The demands from the the East. And I'm now musing on what I don't know, because I don't know of that having surfaced again as a major challenge to the framework for a December 2021 or an early 2022 parliamentary election if that process had gone ahead. I'm certainly not aware that it did. So in the absence of hearing otherwise, I don't think that is a major obstacle to the potential parliamentary path forward that that the basis on which it's been negotiated in the past hopefully can provide a basis going forward too.
Thanks. We're back again at the framework for political dialogue, unsurprisingly, of course, and also a little bit back to your roadmap, Elham. I would also like to give you the chance to comment on these 3 dimensions, and if you like, also to address one more question, which is about the chances for a reconciliation process or the basis for a transitional justice process. If you can add one more dimension as we're getting also closer towards the end of this discussion.
There isn't much for me to add on the previous 3 points, but I'll just want to, again, a bit of pedantry, but there's obviously a difference between decentralization and federalism. And I think it's important to appreciate that there is that nuance when we have the conversation, because in our research, what we found is the conflating of those topics or those themes created much confusion in people, and actually sometimes people demanding things that are different to what they expect if they get that demand. In some of our research, we found that when people were talking about federalism, it was a shorthand for actually decentralization. And I think for me, that's an interesting point, because it kind of shows, it's kind of a reactionary point to having had so much centralization under the Gaddafi regime and that kind of feel of one winner takes all kind of mentality. Yet that is what we're resorting to with all these political processes, fixating on a presidency with no clear parameters or limitations of power on such president. And so it's kind of counterintuitive to be talking about decentralization, yet we're building a model which is fundamentally based on a centralized power. So it's about taking a moment to differentiate and really understand, and then it brings us back to the overall comment of bringing the Libyan citizen properly into this conversation and discussing these topics in a longer form than shorthand surveys. In terms of reconciliation, I'm really grateful that that's come up. Again, terminology in Libya, we conflate transitional justice with reconciliation. Reconciliation, in my mind, is a consequence of an adequate transitional justice process. It's not an activity in its own right. For you to achieve genuine reconciliation, you need other pillars of transitional justice to be present. And here we go back to accountability and perpetrators being held responsible for what they've done in the process of transition and before transition and all the causes to deal with the conflict. There's a question of establishing the truth, which there's much work to be done on in Libya. There's the question of thinking about reparations, and that's not, again, the misconception that reparations mean compensation. There's reparation of people acknowledging what's happened. There's so many crimes in Libya that are not even acknowledged, let alone discussed or repaired. Correcting the historical record. And then the fourth one is ensuring that there's no recurrence again. And then that's, again, talking about putting the legal framework in place. And so if you look at the roadmap, one of the biggest debates we had is that the fundamental draft that was prepared by the UN referenced amnesty and reconciliation as the basis of a transitional justice process, which goes against everything that true transitional justice should be about. And so I think it's really important that when we think about reconciliation, I ask as a request that people think of a reconciliation as the outcome of a genuine process, as opposed to an activity that you do by having a few people from different tribes meeting and eating a meal together and shaking hands for a photo.
Thanks very much. We have analyzed a lot of challenges. I'm also grateful that you also took the push to also think forward together. I would like to give you all the chance to end with one sentence on something that you would hope for or an opportunity that you see for the Libyan process. So I will open the floor once more for one last sentence. Wolfram, please.
You really put me on the spot there. No, I'm, as you might have noticed, I'm much better at pointing out the obstacles and the problems than the opportunities.
Ian.
Well, my focus is the international actors, and they simply have to come to their senses, both in terms of mutual responsibility to act together and realism as to the consequences of the path that they advocate. And that's not what they're doing at the moment.
Elham.
My position is to, well, unlike Wolfram, I'm an optimist always, otherwise it would be very miserable doing my job. But I would say that, you know, the key takeaway for us is to really remember that this process is not about the elite, but about the Libyan people, like the normal citizens like us. And that does not mean tokenistic gestures, and it does not mean quick solutions. It means a genuine engagement with us as adults and free-thinking adults, and allowing us the space to do that thinking and to come up with our own visions for our country.
Thanks so much, Elham, also for ending on a very positive note. I would like to thank the three of you very much, very cordially for a substantive analysis, discussion, interesting ideas, many challenges, but also some ideas for the way forward. And my hope is that we could come again together for such a discussion in the future, and then maybe also have some positive developments that we can discuss and build on. I would like to thank you all in the audience, and thanks also for your questions and for actively participating in this discussion. Thanks a lot. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.